The day I found out my marriage was arranged wasn't the day I got married. It was 3 years later, when I overheard my mother-in-law say she was the safest choice, the only one who would never leave him, no matter what he's done. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't chosen to be loved. I was chosen to stay. I used to think my life had fallen into place the moment I married Daniel Hayes. Looking back now, I realize everything felt right a little too easily. We met at a charity dinner, one of those quiet, elegant events where everyone speaks softly and smiles just enough. I remember standing near the window, holding a glass of untouched wine, already planning my exit. And then she appeared. Margaret Hayes, Daniel's mother. She didn't introduce herself right away. Instead, she stood beside me, looked out at the city lights, and said almost casually, "You don't belong in rooms like this, do you?" It should have offended me. But it didn't. Because she was right. I laughed, and that was the beginning. Within minutes, she was asking me questions, not the usual polite ones, but deeper ones. About my work, my family, what I valued, what I feared. It felt strange, intimate even, like she was studying me. At the time, I thought it was kindness. Now I know better. That same night, she introduced me to her son, Daniel Hayes. He was nothing like the other men in that room. While they talked over people, Daniel listened. While they boasted, he stayed quiet. There was something steady about him, something safe. We talked for hours. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything. Everything after that moved quickly. Too quickly. Dinner invitations turned into weekend trips. Conversations turned into confessions. Within 6 months, Daniel proposed. I remember hesitating. Not because I didn't care about him, but because everything felt perfectly aligned. Like a story that had already been written. When I mentioned this to Margaret, she simply smiled. "Sometimes," she said gently, "the right things don't need time. They just need recognition." I believed her. God, I really did. The wedding was beautiful. Small, tasteful, exactly the way Margaret insisted it should be. She handled everything. The venue, the guest list, even my dress. At the time, I told myself she was just being helpful, thoughtful, even. After all, I had never had a mother who cared enough to be involved. Margaret filled that space so naturally, I didn't question it. Not once. And Daniel, he never objected. Not when she chose the house we would live in. Not when she insisted on weekly family dinners. Not even when she kept a key to our front door. "She just likes to make sure everything runs smoothly," he told me once, brushing it off with a soft smile. And I nodded. Because it didn't seem like control. It seemed like care. At least, that's what I told myself. But there were moments, small ones, that didn't quite fit. Like how Margaret always knew things I hadn't told her. Or how she would answer questions directed at Daniel before he even opened his mouth. Or the way she looked at me sometimes. Not unkindly, but carefully, as if she was checking something, measuring. I ignored those moments. Because everything else was good. No better than good. Our home was peaceful. Our routines were stable. Daniel was gentle, dependable, predictable in a way that made life feel easy, safe. And maybe that was the problem. Because real love isn't always this quiet, this controlled, this perfect. I didn't realize it then. But I had already stepped into something that had been planned long before I arrived. And the most dangerous part? I walked into it willingly. At first, I told myself it was just adjustment. Every marriage takes time, right? New habits, new rhythms, new people. And Margaret, she was just part of the package. That's what I thought. It started with small things. So small they almost felt insignificant. Like how she rearranged our kitchen the second week after we moved in. I came home from work and couldn't find anything. The spices were in different jars. The plates had been moved. Even the coffee cups I used every morning were gone. I stood there for a while, opening cabinet after cabinet, feeling oddly displaced. Daniel noticed. "Oh," he said lightly, "Mom came by earlier. She thought this layout would be more efficient." More efficient. I nodded slowly. "Did you ask her to do that?" He hesitated. Just for a second. No. But she's good at these things. That was the first time something inside me tightened. Not enough to argue. Just enough to notice. Then there were the dinners. Every Sunday. No exceptions. At Margaret's house. At first I didn't mind. She was a good cook, and the house always felt warm, welcoming in a quiet, polished way. But over time, I realized those dinners weren't just meals. They were structured. Margaret controlled the conversation like a conductor leading an orchestra. She asked questions, directed topics, even decided when it was time for dessert. And Daniel followed her lead effortlessly, like he always had. Sometimes I would try to shift the conversation, bring up something personal, something real. But Margaret would gently redirect it. Not rudely, just precisely, as if certain topics didn't belong at her table. And then there was the key. I didn't know she had one at first. Not until I walked out of the shower one afternoon and found her standing in our living room, adjusting the curtains. I froze. She turned, smiling as if nothing was unusual. "Oh, Evelyn," she said, completely calm. "I didn't realize you were home." I wrapped the towel tighter around myself. "How did you get in?" She held up a small set of keys. "Daniel gave me one. For emergencies." Emergencies. I looked around the room. The cushions had been straightened. The books on the shelf were aligned perfectly. Even the flowers I had bought that morning had been rearranged into a different vase. This didn't feel like an emergency. This felt like ownership. That night, I brought it up. Carefully. "I didn't know your mother had a key," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. Daniel barely looked up from his phone. "Yeah. She's always had one." "Always? For what exactly?" He sighed, like I was overcomplicating something simple. "In case we need her." "It's not a big deal, Evelyn." "Not a big deal." I stared at him for a moment. Then I nodded. Because I didn't want to be that wife. The difficult one. The paranoid one. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew. Margaret always knew when to show up. Always knew what we needed, before we said anything. She would bring groceries we hadn't mentioned. Fix things we hadn't noticed were broken. Offer advice we hadn't asked for. At first, it felt like care. Then it started to feel like surveillance. One evening, I came home earlier than usual. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I stepped inside and stopped. The air smelled different. Like someone else had been there. I moved slowly through the living room. My eyes scanning everything. Nothing was out of place. That was the problem. Everything was too perfect. And then I heard it. A voice. Soft. Calm. Familiar. Coming from the kitchen. I walked closer, my heart beating just a little faster. Margaret stood by the counter, her back to me, speaking on the phone. Her tone was different. Lower. Sharper. Not the warm, gentle voice she used with me. I froze before she could see me. "Yes," she was saying quietly. A pause. Then. "She's adjusting better than I expected." My breath caught. Another pause. And then the words that made my stomach drop. "She doesn't know yet." Silence filled the room. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. Because for the first time, I wasn't sure I was part of this family. Or something much more carefully placed within it. I didn't confront her. Not that night. I wish I could say it was because I was being strategic, or calm, or smart. But the truth was simpler than that. I was scared of the answer. I stayed where I was, just out of sight, barely breathing. Margaret hadn't noticed me. She continued speaking, her voice low, controlled. "No, she hasn't asked any questions," she said. A pause. Then almost amused. "And even if she does, Daniel will handle it." My fingers tightened against the wall. "Handle it?" Another pause. "I told you," she continued softly. "She's exactly what we needed." Needed. The word echoed in my head like something sharp. Not wanted. Not loved. Needed. I stepped back before she could turn around. Quietly. Carefully. By the time she ended the call and walked into the hallway, I was already upstairs, sitting on the edge of the bed like I had been there the entire time. When she knocked, I forced a smile. "Evelyn? I didn't realize you were home." Her voice had changed again. Warm. Gentle. Familiar. I looked up at her. I got back early, I said. She studied my face for a fraction of a second. Just a fraction. But it was enough. Enough for me to realize something I hadn't noticed before. Margaret didn't just observe. She evaluated. Constantly. Are you feeling all right? She asked, stepping into the room. Fine. Another pause. Her eyes lingered on me, searching. As if she was trying to decide whether I had heard something. Whether I knew something. I held her gaze. Smiled just enough. And for the first time since I met her, I pretended. That night I didn't sleep. I lay beside Daniel, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in my head. She's exactly what we needed. She doesn't know yet. The words circled, over and over, refusing to settle into anything I could understand. Or maybe, refusing to become something I didn't want to understand. The next morning, everything felt normal again. Too normal. Daniel kissed my forehead before leaving for work. Margaret texted me a recipe she thought I would love. The house was quiet, peaceful, untouched by whatever had happened the night before. It almost made me question myself. Almost. But once you hear something like that, you can't unhear it. I started noticing more. Little details that used to slip past me. Like how Margaret always asked about my schedule, what time I'd be home, where I'd be going. Or how Daniel never seemed surprised when she showed up. As if she already knew. As if they had already talked. That afternoon, I decided to test something. I told Daniel I would be working late. A simple lie. Nothing dramatic. Just enough. He nodded, distracted. All right, he said. Don't stay too late. I smiled. I won't. But instead of going to work, I stayed nearby, sat in my car down the street, watching the house, waiting. It didn't take long. Exactly 40 minutes after Daniel left, Margaret arrived. No call. No message. No hesitation. She walked straight to the front door and let herself in, like she belonged there. My chest tightened. Not from anger. From clarity. I waited another 10 minutes before going inside. Slowly. Quietly. This time, I didn't stop in the hallway. I walked straight into the living room. Margaret stood by the bookshelf, holding one of Daniel's old photo albums. She looked up when she saw me. No surprise. Not even a flicker. Just that same calm, composed expression. Oh, she said softly. You're home early. I stepped closer. My heart was steady now. Too steady. Yeah, I replied. A pause. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since the night before. How did you know I wouldn't be here? The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It wasn't shock. It was something else entirely. Something controlled. Measured. Margaret closed the photo album gently. Set it down. And then she smiled. Not warmly. Not kindly. But knowingly. I didn't, she said. A beat. Then. I just knew Daniel would tell me if anything changed. And in that moment, I realized something far more dangerous than secrets. I wasn't just living in a house with my husband. I was living inside a system. One where information moved faster than I did. One where decisions were made, before I even knew there was a choice. And whatever this was, I was already behind. I didn't always question how I met Daniel. For the longest time, I treated it like a lucky accident. The kind people write about in stories. Two strangers crossing paths at the right moment. And everything just clicks. Simple. Natural. Unplanned. But once doubt enters your mind, it doesn't leave quietly. It rewrites everything. I found myself going back to that night again. The charity dinner. The way Margaret appeared beside me before I ever noticed her. The way she spoke to me, not like a stranger, but like someone who already understood me. Too well. At the time, I thought it was intuition. Now, it felt like preparation. I tried to remember the exact sequence of events. Not the feelings. The details. Who spoke first? Who moved where? Who introduced who? Margaret didn't ask me my name right away. She asked about my work. my routine. Whether I preferred stability or risk. Who asks that kind of question 5 minutes into a conversation? I didn't think it was strange then. I answered everything. Honestly. Openly. Like I had nothing to hide. And then, only after all of that, she introduced me to Daniel. Not casually. Not randomly. Deliberately. Daniel, she said, placing a gentle hand on his arm. There's someone I'd like you to meet. Not you should meet. Not this is Evelyn. But someone I'd like you to meet. I remember the way he looked at me. Curious. Calm. Almost expectant. Like he already knew I was coming. At the time, I told myself I was imagining things. That I was romanticizing a perfectly normal moment. But now I wasn't so sure. The more I thought about it, the more everything felt aligned. Too aligned. We liked the same things. Disliked the same things. Even our schedules fit together effortlessly. It wasn't just compatibility. It was precision. 3 nights later, Margaret invited me to dinner. Nothing formal, she said with a soft smile. Just us. I went. Of course I did. Her house was exactly what you'd expect. Elegant. Controlled. Immaculate. Every object had a place. Every detail felt intentional. Dinner was quiet. Measured. Margaret asked questions again. More this time. Deeper. But she didn't just listen. She observed. Every answer I gave. She seemed to weigh it. Like she was confirming something. Not learning. Confirming. At one point, I excused myself to use the restroom. And that's when I saw it. Her study door was slightly open. Just enough. I wasn't trying to snoop. At least, that's what I told myself. But something about that room pulled me in. The desk was perfectly arranged. Files stacked neatly. Labels facing outward. Everything in order. And then I saw my name. It was written on a thin folder near the edge of the desk. Simple. Clean. Evelyn Carter. My heart skipped. I stared at it for a moment, trying to convince myself it meant nothing. That it was a coincidence. That maybe I had mentioned something she wrote down. But I hadn't. I was sure of it. I stepped closer. Slowly. Reached out. My fingers hovering just above the folder. And then, footsteps. I pulled my hand back immediately. Too quickly. Stepped away just as Margaret's voice appeared behind me. Did you find everything all right? I turned. Forced a smile. Yes. Sorry, I got a little lost. She looked at me. Not suspicious. Not surprised. Just calm. Her gaze shifted briefly toward the desk. Toward the folder. Then back to me. And she smiled. Of course, she said gently. It's your first time here. First time. The way she said it didn't sound like a beginning. It sounded like something that had already been planned long before I arrived. That night, when I left her house, I remember feeling something I couldn't explain. Not fear. Not exactly. Just the faintest sense that I had stepped into something that already knew who I was. Before I ever knew them. I didn't go back to Margaret's study that night. But the image of that folder, my name, printed cleanly across the front, it didn't leave me. At first, I tried to explain it away. Maybe she just liked to keep notes. Maybe she was organized. Maybe I had mentioned something and she wrote it down. People do that. Some people. But deep down, I knew. That wasn't what I saw. The next few days felt different. Not outwardly. Everything still looked the same. Daniel went to work. I followed my routine. Margaret sent her usual messages, recipes, reminders, small check-ins that felt almost thoughtful. Almost. But something had shifted inside me. I wasn't just living anymore. I was watching. I started paying attention to things I used to ignore. The way Margaret asked questions, not open-ended but targeted. How is your sleep lately? Have you been feeling stressed at work? Do you still talk to your father often? At the time, they sounded like concern. Now they sounded like data collection. And Daniel, he didn't notice. Or maybe, he didn't want to. 3 days after I saw the folder, I went back. Not to her house. To the beginning. I opened my laptop and searched my old messages. Scrolled back to the very first texts between me and Daniel. I remembered them being natural. Easy. But reading them again, something felt off. He didn't ask many questions. Not really. Most of the time he responded. Agreed. Adapted. Like he already knew what to say. Then I noticed something else. The timing. Before our first date, there was a gap. Almost 2 days. No messages. Nothing. But I remembered that time clearly, because that was when Margaret had called me. I hadn't thought much of it then. She said she just wanted to check in. To see how I felt about Daniel. To make sure I was comfortable. I told her everything. That I liked him. That he felt safe. That I could see something real with him. At the time it felt harmless. Now, it felt like a report. My chest tightened. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the folder. The way my name sat there like it belonged. Like I wasn't a person, but a file. So I made a decision. The next Sunday during dinner, I waited. Watched Margaret carefully. Listened to every word. Every pause. And then casually, like it didn't matter, I said, I stopped by your house the other night. Daniel looked up briefly. Margaret didn't. Oh, she said, cutting into her food. Did you need something? I held her gaze. I saw your study. That made her pause. Just for a second. Barely noticeable. But I saw it. I didn't realize you kept files on people, I added. Silence. Daniel frowned slightly. What do you mean? But Margaret. She didn't look confused. She didn't look defensive. She simply placed her fork down, folded her hands neatly in front of her, and looked at me. Calm. Composed. Then she smiled. They're not files, she said gently. They're notes. Notes. I leaned back slightly. About me? Another pause. And then, without hesitation, yes. Daniel shifted in his seat. Mom. But she raised her hand slightly, stopping him. Her eyes never left mine. I like to understand the people who come into my family, she continued. It helps me make better decisions. Better decisions. My pulse quickened. What kind of decisions? I asked quietly. The room felt smaller, tighter. Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying me. The important ones, she said. And then, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, she added. Like choosing the right person for my son to marry. The words landed softly, but they didn't feel soft. They felt precise, intentional, final. And in that moment, the folder, the questions, the introductions, none of it felt like coincidence anymore. It felt like selection. Daniel didn't say anything on the drive home. Not at first. His hands stayed steady on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road like nothing had happened. Like his mother hadn't just calmly admitted to choosing me. Like that was normal. I sat beside him, staring out the window, watching the city lights blur past. Waiting. Finally, I broke the silence. You knew. It wasn't a question. Daniel exhaled slowly. Not surprised. Not defensive. Just tired. It's not what you think, he said quietly. I turned to look at him. Then tell me what it is. A long pause. The kind that stretches just enough to say everything without saying anything at all. She didn't force anything, he said. She just introduced us. I let out a small, humorless laugh. Introduced us? He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. You liked me, Evelyn. That's not the point. My voice was sharper now. Did you know she had been evaluating me? Writing things down? Deciding if I was suitable for you? Another pause. Longer this time. And that was my answer. You did, I whispered. Daniel finally glanced at me. I didn't know the extent of it. The extent. I shook my head slowly. You're not even denying it. It wasn't like that, he insisted. She just wanted to make sure. Make sure what? I cut in. That I wouldn't leave? Silence. That word again. Leave. I stared at him, something heavy settling in my chest. How many? I asked. He frowned. What? How many women before me? Daniel looked back at the road. Didn't answer. Daniel. 2, he said finally. The number hit harder than I expected. What happened to them? They just didn't work out. Or she decided they didn't. He didn't argue. That told me everything. I leaned back in my seat, the air in the car suddenly feeling too thin. So what was I? I asked quietly. Daniel hesitated. And for a moment, just a moment, I saw something in his expression. Not guilt. Not exactly. Uncertainty. You were different, he said. I let out a slow breath. Different how? Another pause. She liked you. I closed my eyes. Of course she did. Because I was easy. Because I didn't question things. Because I fit. She said you were stable, he added. Stable. I opened my eyes again. Looked at him. Really looked at him. And that was enough for you? Daniel's jaw tightened. I thought it could become something real. Could become. Not was. Not is. Could become. My job. My background. My routines. Even things I barely remembered mentioning. Asterisk values stability. Asterisk. Asterisk avoids conflict. Asterisk. Asterisk high emotional tolerance. Asterisk. I felt like I couldn't breathe. And then, the final page. I stared at it. Asterisk conclusion. Ideal candidate. Asterisk. Ideal. Not loved. Not chosen. Selected. A sound behind me made me freeze. The soft click of a door. I turned slowly. Margaret stood at the entrance. She didn't look surprised. She looked calm. Like this moment had already been accounted for. I was wondering when you'd come back in here, she said quietly. My grip tightened on the folder. You kept records, I said, my voice barely steady. I kept notes, she corrected gently. On women your son dated? Her gaze didn't waver. On women who might become part of this family. My chest rose and fell unevenly. You decided for him, I said. No, she replied calmly. I protected him. Protected. I took a step forward. By eliminating anyone who didn't fit your criteria? Her expression didn't change. By ensuring his life remained stable. I shook my head, disbelief flooding through me. So you chose me. A pause. Yes. The word landed heavier than anything else she had said. Because I wouldn't leave? I asked. Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying me again. Because you wouldn't destroy what he's built, she said. Destroy? I laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. You don't even hear yourself, do you? She stepped closer, calm, measured. You think this is about control, she said. I met her eyes. Isn't it? A small pause. And then, for the first time, something in her expression shifted. Not guilt. Not regret. Conviction. No, she said quietly. This is about survival. And somehow, that answer was worse. I didn't leave. Even after everything she showed me. Even after the files, the notes, the quiet certainty in her voice. I stayed. Not because I didn't understand what was happening, but because now, I needed to understand why. Margaret stood across from me, watching. Not worried. Not defensive. Just patient. Like she had already calculated this outcome. You said this is about survival, I said slowly. Whose? A brief pause. Then. My son's. Of course. Everything came back to Daniel. I tightened my grip on the folder. You're treating his life like a system, I said. Like something that needs to be managed. Margaret didn't deny it. Because it does. The certainty in her voice sent something cold through me. You don't understand him the way I do, she continued. I let out a quiet breath. Then help me understand. For the first time since I walked into that room, she hesitated. Just slightly. Her eyes shifted, not away from me but inward, like she was deciding something. And then she spoke. Daniel wasn't always like this, she said. The words felt heavier than they should. What does that mean? I asked. Margaret walked past me slowly, moving toward the desk. Her fingers brushed lightly against the folders, aligning them without thinking. He used to be impulsive, she said. Emotional. He trusted people too easily. I frowned. That doesn't sound like a flaw. It is, she replied sharply. If it costs you everything. The room felt tighter. What happened? I asked. Silence. For a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. Then, there was someone, she said. Of course there was. A few years before you, she continued. He thought he was in love. My chest tightened slightly. What happened to her? I asked. Margaret's expression hardened. She almost destroyed him. The way she said it. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just factual. How? I pressed. Another pause. Longer this time. She made choices, Margaret said carefully. And Daniel trusted her enough to follow. Follow? To where? I asked. Margaret looked at me. Really looked at me. And for the first time, there was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Not control. Not calculation. Fear. To a place he couldn't come back from, she said quietly. A chill ran down my spine. What does that mean? I whispered. But she didn't answer directly. Instead, she stepped closer. That's when I realized something, she said. Her voice softened, but not in a comforting way. In this world, love is unpredictable. It makes people reckless. It makes them weak. I shook my head slowly. That's not love. It is, she replied. And that's why it's dangerous. Silence settled between us. Heavy. Uncomfortable. So you replaced it, I said quietly. Her gaze didn't waver. I controlled it. The words landed harder than anything else she had said. You chose someone safe, I continued. Yes. Someone stable. Yes. Someone who wouldn't leave, no matter what. A pause. Then, yes. I felt something shift inside me. Not shock. Not anymore. Understanding. You didn't choose me because I was right for him, I said. Margaret tilted her head slightly. I chose you because you wouldn't break him. Break him? I let out a slow breath. And what if he breaks me? I asked. That made her pause. Just for a moment. But it was enough. Because in that silence, I realized something she hadn't considered. She had calculated everything. Every outcome. Every risk. Except one. Me. I didn't go home right away. After I left Margaret's house, I just drove. No destination. No plan. Just movement. Because standing still suddenly felt impossible. Her words wouldn't leave me. Asterisk. I chose you because you wouldn't break him. Asterisk. What did that even mean? What had Daniel done that required someone like me? By the time I got home, it was already dark. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Daniel was sitting in the living room when I walked in. The lights were dim, the TV on but muted, casting a soft flicker across his face. He looked up the moment he saw me. You went to see her, he said. Not a question. I didn't bother denying it. Yes. A pause. And he asked. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me slowly. She showed me everything. His expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. What do you mean? He asked carefully. I walked closer, dropped my bag on the table. The files, I said. The notes. The evaluations. A beat. Me. Silence. Daniel leaned back slightly, running a hand through his hair. I told you, he said quietly. I didn't know the extent of it. That's not what this is about anymore. My voice was steady now. Too steady. What is it about then? He asked. I looked at him. Really looked at him. Who was she? He froze. The shift was instant. Subtle, but unmistakable. Who? He said. I didn't blink. The one before me. Silence filled the room. Thick. Heavy. Daniel looked away first. It doesn't matter, he said. It does to me. Another pause. I'm your wife, I continued. I deserve to know what I walked into. His jaw tightened. You didn't walk into anything, he said. We built this together. No, irraplia soufli. You built this with her. That hit something. I saw it in the way his shoulders tensed. Evelyn. What happened to her? I asked again. This time my voice didn't waver. Another long silence. And then, slowly, he exhaled. Her name was Claire. The name felt ordinary. Too ordinary for the weight it carried. We were together for almost 2 years, he continued. She was different. I almost laughed. Of course she was. How? I asked. Daniel hesitated. She didn't listen to my mother. That wasn't surprising. And I pressed. She didn't listen to me either. That was new. I stayed quiet, waiting. She had plans, he said slowly. Big ones. Business ideas. Investments. Ambitious, I said. He nodded. At first I admired it, he admitted. She made everything feel alive. Alive. The word lingered. What changed? I asked. Daniel looked down at his hands. She convinced me to invest in something, he said. A pause. It didn't work. How bad? I asked. Silence. Then, bad enough. That wasn't an answer. Daniel. He looked up at me. I lost everything, he said quietly. The word settled slowly. Everything. I repeated. My savings. My company at the time. A beat. My reputation. My chest tightened. And her? I asked. Another pause. She left. Of course she did. When? I asked. Right after. Silence filled the room again. And your mother? I said. Daniel let out a dry laugh. She was the one who cleaned it up. Cleaned it up? How? I asked. He didn't answer right away. She rebuilt everything, he said finally. Piece by piece. I felt something cold settle in my chest. At what cost? I asked. Daniel looked at me. And for the first time, there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Not guilt. Not shame. Fear. You don't want to know, he said quietly. I held his gaze. Yes, I said. Because now I understood something Margaret never said directly. She didn't just choose me to protect him. She chose me because she knew exactly what he was capable of losing. And exactly what she couldn't afford to lose again. I didn't sleep that night. Not even for a minute. Daniel's words kept replaying in my head. Asterisk, I lost everything. Asterisk. Asterisk, my mother cleaned it up. Asterisk. Asterisk, you don't want to know. Asterisk. But I did. That was the problem. I needed to know. Because whatever had happened before me, it hadn't disappeared. It had just been contained. The house felt different now. Not unfamiliar. Not hostile. Controlled. Every object suddenly carried weight. The furniture Margaret chose. The routines she enforced. The silence Daniel lived in so comfortably. None of it was accidental. I walked through the living room slowly, my fingers brushing against the back of the sofa. Perfect. Untouched. This wasn't a home. It was a reconstruction. And I was part of it. Daniel was still awake when I came back downstairs. Sitting in the same spot. Like he hadn't moved. "You're still up," he said quietly. I didn't answer. I just stood there, looking at him. "You said she rebuilt everything," I said. "What does that mean?" He closed his eyes briefly, like he was already exhausted by the question. "It means she fixed it," he replied. "She made sure nothing followed me." Nothing followed. I took a step closer. "That's not how things work, Daniel." His jaw tightened. "You don't understand," he said. "Then explain it to me." Silence. I waited. And then, slowly, he stood up. "There were debts," he said. The word felt too small. "What kind of debts?" I asked. Another pause. "Not just money." My stomach dropped. "Then what?" Daniel looked at me. And this time, he didn't look away. "People," he said quietly. The air in the room shifted. "What do you mean, people?" "They invested too," he continued. "Not through banks. Not through contracts." I felt my pulse start to rise. "You mean?" He nodded once. "Yes." The word landed like something final. "And when everything collapsed?" I asked. Daniel let out a slow breath. "They came back." "Of course they did." "And your mother?" I pressed. His expression changed. "She handled it." The same words. Again. "How?" I asked. This time he hesitated longer. "You really want to know?" he said. "Yes." A beat. "She paid them," he said. "Every last one." I frowned. "With what?" Another pause. "Everything we had," he replied. My chest tightened. "That's not possible," I said. "You said you lost everything." I did. "Then where did the money come from?" Silence. Daniel looked at me. Really looked at me. And then he said something that made everything inside me go still. "She didn't use her money." A pause. "She used leverage." Leverage. The word echoed in my mind, heavy and unclear. "What kind of leverage?" I asked slowly. Daniel didn't answer right away. And that silence, it told me more than anything else. Because whatever Margaret had done, it wasn't simple. It wasn't clean. It wasn't something he could say out loud. "She made it go away," he said finally. "That's all that matters." No, that wasn't all that mattered. Because now I understood something I hadn't before. Margaret didn't just protect her son. She erased consequences. And in doing that, she changed the rules. I looked around the house again. At the calm, the order, the silence. And suddenly, it didn't feel safe anymore. It felt like something built on top of something else. Something buried. "Daniel," I said quietly. He looked at me. "What happens if it doesn't stay buried?" The question hung between us. And for the first time since all of this began, he didn't have an answer. Because deep down, we both knew. Some things don't disappear. They wait. I didn't go to Margaret. Not immediately. Because for the first time since this began, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was thinking. Everything finally fit together now. The control. The selection. The silence. Daniel didn't just need someone stable. He needed someone who wouldn't ask questions. Who wouldn't dig. Who wouldn't look beneath the surface of the life his mother rebuilt for him. And I had been exactly that. Until now. That evening, I asked Daniel one simple question. Does she know I know? He didn't need to ask who she was. Yes, he said quietly. Of course she did. Margaret always knew. I nodded slowly. Good. Daniel frowned. Good, he repeated. I met his eyes. I don't want to keep pretending. Something in my voice made him tense. Evelyn, he started. But I shook my head. No, I said. No more half-truths. No more silence. A pause. I'm going to talk to her. The words landed between us like something final. Daniel stepped closer. That's not a good idea. I almost smiled. Why? I asked softly. Because she'll control the conversation? He didn't answer. Because we both knew that was exactly what would happen. Unless I didn't let her. I'm not asking for permission, I added. And that's when something shifted. Daniel looked at me differently. Not like before. Not like someone he was comfortable with. But like someone he didn't recognize anymore. You're changing, he said. I held his gaze. No. Quietly. I'm just paying attention now. Margaret opened the door before I even knocked. Of course she did. She stood there, perfectly composed as always. Elegant. Calm. Prepared. I was expecting you, she said. I stepped inside without answering. The house felt the same. Controlled. Measured. But this time, I wasn't intimidated by it. I turned to face her. We need to talk. She nodded once. I agree. No denial. No deflection. Just acceptance. We sat across from each other in the living room. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, I broke the silence. You didn't just protect him, I said. Margaret's expression didn't change. You controlled everything. A pause. Yes. No hesitation. No apology. I let out a slow breath. You chose me, I continued. You shaped this entire marriage. Yes. Again. Calm. Certain. I leaned forward slightly. Did you ever think about what I wanted? For the first time, she paused. Not long, but enough. I chose someone who would be happy here, she said. I almost laughed. You chose someone who wouldn't leave. Her eyes met mine. Isn't that what matters? The question hung in the air. And for a second, I understood her. Not agreed, not accepted, but understood. To her, love wasn't the priority. Control was. Stability was. Survival was. You think you saved him, I said quietly. I did. And what about me? Silence. She didn't answer. Because for the first time, there was no calculation for that. I wasn't part of your plan, I continued. Her gaze sharpened slightly. No, she said. And that was the truth. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Because in that moment, I realized something she hadn't. She planned everything, every variable, every outcome. Except one thing. What happens when the person you chose to stay decides they don't have to anymore? I didn't walk out that night. Not immediately. Margaret was still watching me, calm, waiting, like she always did. She expected a reaction. Anger, tears, maybe even gratitude twisted into confusion. But I gave her none of that. Instead, I stood up slowly. You're right, I said. For the first time, she looked surprised. Just slightly. You chose someone who wouldn't leave, I continued. You built everything around that assumption. Her eyes narrowed just a fraction. Yes. I nodded. And you were right. Silence. Margaret studied me now, not as a daughter-in-law, not even as part of the family, but as something unfamiliar. Because I wasn't reacting the way she expected. I didn't leave, I said softly. A pause. I stayed. Her voice came quieter this time. Because you understood. I almost smiled. No, I said. Because I saw something you didn't. That made her still. What is that? She asked. I held her gaze. Opportunity. The word hung between us. Sharp. Unexpected. You think I didn't know something was wrong? I continued. That things felt controlled? Too perfect. Her expression didn't change. But I saw it. That flicker. Uncertainty. I knew, I said. Now she leaned forward slightly. Then why did you stay? She asked. Finally. The question she never thought she'd need to ask. I took a slow breath. Because I wanted to see how far you'd go. Silence. And now you have, she said. Yes. A beat. And now I know something you don't. Her eyes locked onto mine. What is that? She asked again. I stepped closer. You built this life to protect your son from losing everything, I said. Yes. You removed risk. Yes. You controlled every variable. Yes. I nodded slowly. And in doing that, I paused. You made him dependent. The words landed differently this time. Not dramatic, but precise. Margaret didn't speak. Daniel doesn't choose anything, I continued. Not his life. Not his decisions. A pause. Not even me. Something shifted in her eyes. Not denial. Recognition. And you think that's protection? I asked quietly. Silence. For him maybe, I said. Another step closer. But not for you. That made her frown. You built everything around him, I continued. Everything depends on him staying exactly the way you need him to be. A pause. But people change. Her voice came lower now. What are you saying? I met her gaze. I'm saying. A breath. You didn't choose someone who wouldn't leave. A beat. You chose someone who would stay long enough to understand the system. Another beat. And then decide what to do with it. The room went still. For the first time, Margaret didn't look in control. You think you have control now? She asked. I didn't answer right away. Because this wasn't about control. Not anymore. I think, I said slowly, you underestimated the one variable you couldn't measure. Her eyes narrowed. Which is? I held her gaze. Choice. Silence. Heavy. Unavoidable. Because for the first time, this wasn't her system anymore. It wasn't her plan. It was mine. When I got home, Daniel was still there, waiting. He stood the moment I walked in. What happened? He asked. I looked at him. Really looked at him. For the first time, not as the man I married, but as someone who had never truly chosen his own life. We talked, I said. And a pause. I'm not leaving, I said. Relief flooded his face instantly. Too fast. Too easy. And that told me everything. But things are going to change, I added. The relief faded. What do you mean? He asked. I stepped closer. It means you start choosing, I said. For yourself. He hesitated. And if I don't? I held his gaze. Then I will. Silence. Because now, this wasn't about Margaret anymore. It wasn't about the past. It wasn't even about the marriage. It was about something much simpler. Something she could never control. And something he had never learned to use. Choice. And this time, it wouldn't be made for him.